And so, we commit Malcolm Tyler to the earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The dirt hit the top of the child-sized coffin as it slid into its final resting place. John just sat there, surrounded by family and friends, yet utterly alone. Malcolm had been 10, on the cusp of the age of reason. As John looked at the picture of his departed son, he could swear it was one of his own baby pictures. Malcolm had loved baseball, superheroes, Star Wars, and old video games. He had clung to his father's passions, and the two had always been close. As he watched the coffin slip into the earth, John felt the tears slide down his face. They were naked and unashamed. The seat next to him was empty. His wife, Claire, was still in the hospital after the accident that had taken their son. The doctor had told him that she would likely recover, but she might never walk again. They had told him this as though it were a spectacular consolation prize. Your son will never play in the majors or even see the Star Wars movie he was looking forward to, but you can rest assured that your now crippled wife will be home as soon as we're done milking your insurance for all it's worth. He sat there and accepted the pats, the condolences, the meaningless words that fell on him like daggers. His son was gone. These people were telling him how sorry they were for his loss. They didn't know loss. They were going to climb into their vehicle with mostly complete partners and go back to their homes so they could hug their own children and be glad it wasn't them who'd lost someone important. They would put the funeral announcements in a drawer by the door where they kept their keys or their change, and one day they would drag it out by mistake and think how sad it had been that such a youngster had died in the prime of his life. Then they would throw it away or put it in another drawer, and they would probably never think about it again. He seethed over these thoughts as he sat in the hard plastic chair provided by Copeland Funeral Home. He seethed over these people and their routine, unbroken lives until he was the only one there. Then John got up and he went home. John sat and watched TV, eating his TV dinner without much enthusiasm. The turkey was lumpy and had only cooked in the middle. The mashed potatoes were still half frozen, the gravy like liquid lava. On TV, the news anchor was talking about the Green Man murders. The latest victim, Shelley Rhodes, had been discovered in an alley. The police were looking for someone who might have seen the perpetrator. John watched apathetically as he spooned the mush into his mouth. A commercial came on for Anders Tires, and he tuned it out. Malcolm had been dead for 3 days, and John had done little but wallow in his misery. The house was like a monument to better times. He had stood in the entryway most of the afternoon after the funeral, staring at photos of him and Malcolm at the beach. Claire had taken it after they built that sandcastle they were both hunkered over. They had been at the shore for a week. Malcolm was as brown as a nut after spending 6 days on the beach. The castle had begun as a lopsided thing before John had gotten involved. Malcolm had bought the shoddy plastic molds at the beachside stand, and John had known a thing or two about sandcastle building. Together, they had constructed an elegant castle, complete with drawbridge and moat. The turrets had grown out of the sand, the flags had been leaves plucked from a nearby tree. Claire had been laughing as she snapped the photo, and the two of them had been grinning like fools over this accomplishment. John felt tears fall from his eyes, saw them tumble into his unappetizing mashed potatoes, and spooned them into his mouth anyway. Malcolm's room was the worst part of the house. The room stood at the very top of the staircase, easily viewable from the downstairs landing. John had stood in the dark last night and just looked at the doorway from the bottom step. The nightlight cast the scene in a strange shadowverse. He could vaguely see the baseball players trapped in their glory as they hung glossily from the wall by pushpins. He could see the bookshelf where John had taken his son's nightly bedtime story. He could see the balsa wood glider where it hung from the ceiling, the broken wing mocking him. How many times had John promised to fix it? How many times had he told Malcolm he would go buy a tube of airplane glue? How many times had he gone to the store and not done it? He He had thought he had time. He had thought he could do it some other when. He had been wrong. He had slept in his recliner every night after that. The phone rang then, dragging him from his misery. The picture on the screen was that of his wife, smiling like she was the happiest woman in the world as Malcolm grinned from her hugging arms. John felt a sob creep up his throat. He would have to change that. He answered it on the 6th ring, saying hello without much enthusiasm. "Hi, John." His wife sounded tired. She sounded like maybe she had been crying, too. She sounded like John felt, ready to just give up and join their son in his eternal rest. John found he didn't have much of a feeling about that. "Hi, Claire. You didn't come to see me today." He didn't have an answer for that, so he said nothing. "Are you okay, John? I'm worried about you." John thought about the question. He was not, he decided, okay, but if he told his wife this, she would worry. He hadn't come to see her today for that reason. Not for the reason that he suspected that she suspected, which was that he blamed her for his son's death. He no more blamed Claire than he blamed the car she had totaled when a semi-truck, driven by a man who was asleep at the wheel, had crushed their car against the guardrail. He didn't blame her for that. It was an event outside her control. He didn't come to see her because she would look at him and know that something was deeply wrong with him. She would see the dark circles, the pallid skin, the dirty face cleaned only by the tears that seemed to run tirelessly, and she would worry. He didn't care about any of that. Not really. But if she told a doctor about these things, John might spend the next few months as a drooling zombie while they pumped him full of dope. John did not want to dope his pain away. He wanted to wallow in it, like a pig wallows in filth. "John, are you mad at me?" He could hear the tears on the verge of bursting. "No, Kay, I'm just tired," he said, using her pet name. "I haven't slept well since..." His own tears slid out again, pale tracks of moisture that always seemed on the verge of falling. "Since the funeral. I wanted to be there for you, and for him, but I know," he lied. John knew very little that he was confident of these days. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay, John. I wish I were there to help you through this. I wish you were here to help me through this." She was crying now. He could almost hear her tears as they slid against the phone. He stared at the TV like a husk, incapable of feeling empathy for his sobbing wife. "I know, but someone has to pay the bills. Now more than ever." "That was a crock," said a voice in his brain. John had no more been to work than he had been upstairs. Mr. Beadle had given him bereavement, and he had taken it without a fight. He had done little more than sit morosely and fulfill his body's needs when they clawed against his consciousness. Feed the machine, empty the tank, sleep, rinse, repeat. It was all becoming very tedious. "You sound tired. I'll let you get to sleep. Will I see you tomorrow?" "Yeah," he said, lying again. "I'll swing by after work and see how you're doing." "I'd like that. I miss you, John. I love you." "I love you too, Kay." The lies came easily. He hung up the phone and continued to wallow. "Are you happy?" asked the man on the TV. He was a tall fellow, sleek black hair, thin mustache that looked oily. He was wearing a butcher's apron over a white shirt and smiling into the camera like he could see through John's TV. It was a little unsettling. John kept watching, figuring the commercial would be over soon. "Feeling empty? Perhaps seeking something you've lost?" John shoveled more food into his mouth, but felt his eyes locked on the greasy salesman. "Here at Bright Farm, we pride ourselves on helping those who are lost come back into the light. Whatever you're seeking, you can be sure that we have it here at Bright Farm. Our counselors are here 24/7 to..." John lifted the remote, a job that seemed harder than it should have, and flipped over to the next channel. Make sure the light does not escape you in your time of need. What in the hell? It was the same commercial. He clicked over again. Maybe you've recently had a crisis of faith, suffered an event that's made you question the existence of a bright and shining God. Maybe you've lost your way, no longer feeling that life is worth living. John had changed the channel 7 times while the man was talking, but found him on every channel. For some reason, the man was making him uncomfortable, and he wanted to see anything on the tube at that point. A baseball game, an old movie, a stupid sitcom, anything but this man and his smiling, stupid face. As he watched, the smile seemed to stretch under that mustache, and as he clicked the button to turn the set off, he realized that the man's eyes were fixed directly on him. The man was staring at him through the TV. The veins in his eyes seemed to be pulsating as John watched. Maybe you've even lost someone you loved. A mother. A brother. His eyes got very intense, and no matter how many times he hit the off button, the TV stayed on. A son. He was staring right at him now, and clearly only at him. He's here, John. He's here, and all you have to do is come to him. What are you waiting for, John? Why are you just sitting there, John? He misses you, John. The man was screaming from the TV. John was aware that his dinner was leaking into his sweatpants. He had upset the little plastic tray, but it hardly seemed to matter. The man on the TV was beating his fists against the glass front and yelling at John, questioning him, asking him why he didn't come to his son if he missed him so damn much. John was screaming as he did this, and he came awake all at once. The screen was snow, and he had indeed spilled his dinner. He turned off the television, cleaned up his chair, and thought longingly about going up to bed. It took him only a few minutes at the bottom of the stairs to return to his recliner. He slept fitfully that night. John woke up early the next morning, bright and early. This was something he seemed to be unable to shake from his old life. His job had expected him to arrive at 8 a.m. every day, and his brain seemed hardwired to wake up at 6 a.m. every morning. He thought about going to work. Maybe a day at the office would set him right. He could sit in his office and go over accounts and feel like his usual self. He could pretend that when 5 o'clock came around, he could go home to his loving wife and his best buddy in their 2-bedroom, 2-bath home. And when he got off and drove home, he would find it just that way. He only stood at the foot of the stairs for 20 minutes, seeing the pennants on the wall and watching the broken plane hanging suspended from the ceiling, before turning away and going to the kitchen instead. There would be no normal life for him. Never again. The round cereal clinked into the bowl cheerily. The box declared it was Space Acers, and it was Malcolm's favorite cereal. The marshmallows stood out amongst the grain circles. They were the kind of neon color that only a kid could love, the lumpy multicolor of poor craftsmanship and lack of real care. He saw a tear fall into them as he studied them. He remembered how Malcolm had sung the jingle every time he ate them. He remembered how Malcolm could name all 7 different marshmallow shapes, remembering when he'd gotten so excited over that Captain Acer's decoder ring that he'd found in the box last year. He saw another tear roll into the cereal and turned to get the milk. He opened the door and scanned the pristine white glow of the refrigerator for the carton. He was momentarily worried that it was out of date, but suddenly the happy cow face came into view. When he picked it up, he got a nasty shock as he realized that Bright Farm Dairy was printed over the head of the smiling cow. Had that always been his milk provider? He was sure it had been a different company last week. He turned the carton, reading the side description, feeling a kind of surreal haze roll over him. It told how Bright Farm cows were the happiest cows in the world. It told how Bright Farm was the leading provider of dairy for his area. Then he turned the carton and felt it slip out of his numb fingers. As it fell, he could clearly see the missing child picture side of the carton. The black and white photo made it hard to make out his exact features, but John would know the boy's sandy brown hair and green eyes, even in black and white. He was smiling, as he had been in the beach picture, and under the picture was the legend, "Found Child," answers to Malcolm, misses his father, wants to know why his father hasn't come to get him, wants to know why his father doesn't love him. The milk puddled on the ground as his son's face stared up at him from the floor. He felt the tears patter into the pool as he looked down at the spilled milk. "What do you mean you're out of milk?" John had been to 3 different stores, and each of them had been out of milk. The first 2 had had little signs taped over the milk coolers saying, "Sorry, they were out of milk." There had been no one to yell at there, but he had found someone to yell at when he reached the 3rd store. The man in the plastic apron bore it well, clearly not the first irate customer today, and flashed his pasted-on grin in the face of John's ire. "Sorry, sir, but the company had a little trouble with their trucks today. You could try another store, I suppose, but I'm guessing they're all in the same boat." Smug prick, John thought. He knew they were all in the same boat. "You could always go down to Bright Farm and get the milk yourself," the man added, taking a step away as though trying to distance himself from the conversation. John watched him go, breathing out disgustedly as he went back to the parking lot to find his car. He guessed he was going to Bright Farm. Bright Farm looked almost idyllic. John had driven for almost an hour, making his way out of the city's hustle and bustle and into the more rural areas surrounding the town. Here was the farm belt, the farms with acres of land, all planted with vegetables in neat rows, or with livestock happily munching grass in the field. John saw big red barns and farmhouses with long porches, people moving about between them as they went about their daily lives. The road ran on, and when his GPS said he had arrived, he almost didn't believe it. The farm had seemed like a strange place in the infomercial, some kind of farm akin to a backwoods gospel tent, where miracles happened, or at least they claimed they did. This place, though, looked like the farm in the Hidden Valley commercials. The road turned left onto a hard-packed dirt track. John could see fields ripe with produce, an orchard in the distance with happy pickers at work, a long pair of barns for cows or sheep maybe, and several tall wooden houses that looked almost Amish. The sign over the road said, "Bright Farm," in cheery white letters. The place seemed downright peaceful, downright wholesome. John turned his car down the road and drove towards the cluster of buildings. There were 8 two-story buildings of dark brown wood, with heavy windows that looked down from them. To John, they looked like disapproving eyes. Among them, as though surrounded, was a squat little building with a long porch complete with rockers. A sign hung across the roof declaring it to be the General Store. John thought it was as good a place as any for some information, so he mounted the steps and went inside. The bell tinkled overhead merrily. The inside was a packed but orderly arrangement of everything one might need for frontier life at the turn of the century. There were long shelves stacked with sacks of bean and corn, flour and sugar, bolts of cloth and spools of thread, and an overwhelming smell of brine that led him to a huge pickle jar near the front of the door. Behind a long counter stood a man in a butcher's apron, his dark hair and small mustache looking eerily familiar, wearing the biggest smile John had ever seen. He stared intently at John, and the attention made John's skin crawl. "Good morning, stranger. Are you here for the milk?" I guess so," John said. The man cocked his big smiling head and said, "Pardon me for saying so, sir, but you don't really seem too sure." I seem to be drawn here for some reason lately. I see your commercials and your products, and they seem to be calling me here." The man cocked his head to the other side, then snapped his fingers loudly. "I thought you looked familiar. You're John, right?" John jumped a little. How did you know my name?" "Oh, we've been waiting for you. We've been keeping something extraordinary for you. It's in the barn. Come on." The shopkeeper went off into the room behind the counter, beckoning John as he left. John felt drawn to follow him, but as he stepped, he contemplated. Was he really going to just follow the stranger into the back of his store? These people clearly wanted him here for some reason. Why give them what they wanted? Unless they might actually have. "Coming?" called a voice from the back. John was around the counter before he could stop himself. He followed the man into the back of the store, a shadowy mountain of creaking shelves. But to his surprise, the man in the apron was already standing by an open back door. He led him out into the bright dooryard and pointed to a long cowshed he had seen before. If he had thought it looked too big from the road, now it seemed to stretch off towards the field for far too long. It wasn't just the length either. The shed looked odd somehow. It looked like the kind of place that held secrets best left unfounded, like a freak show tent or the back room of a snake handler's revival. John hesitated as the man took a step towards the sheds, not wanting to know what lay inside. The man looked back cheerily. "Don't you want to see what we have for you? He's been waiting for so long." "Who?" John asked, but the man was already walking towards the shed, and John had to step quickly to catch up. The shed door creaked open ominously as the shopkeeper slid it to the side. He reached inside and fumbled against the wall with a loud snap, signaling the lights to life. They clicked on rapidly, lighting overhead fluorescence snapping on in a quick pattern that lit the small wooden berth in the long cowshed. As they stepped inside, the man walked briskly, and John tried to follow as his curious eyes also tried to take in what lay inside of each berth. Most were people, confused and naked as they sat in the straw, but some were full of objects or money or precious items. The worst was the shadowy stall that held things with red eyes and furtive breaths. They huddled in the darkness and looked at him as he went past. Their eyes held no recognizable emotion except hate. After a minute of quick walking, they came to a stop. The man extended his hand towards a closed stall. "This is it. Hurry up. He's waiting for you." John was a few steps behind him, the berth next to this one holding a smashed-up Mercedes. When he heard the man speak, his voice echoing in this strangely quiet place, John shivered a little. He didn't want to disturb the things here, many of which were rather disturbing on their own. John didn't want to know what might happen if they suddenly decided to leave their stalls and come out where they could get at him. As he came up to the gate of the berth in question, he could see a small, naked boy of about 10 sitting on the floor, his knees hugged up to his chest. A head of sandy blonde hair was visible between his knees, and John felt his breath stick in his chest. The hair was soft, baby fine, and looked recently washed. It sat artlessly on top of his small head, just as Malcolm's always had. John felt the tears slide down his face as he remembered how it had poked out underneath his baseball cap when he pulled it down to get it out of his face. Then the boy looked up with those 2 green eyes, and John saw Malcolm smile at him from the straw-strewn floor. "Daddy?" the boy asked, as though he didn't quite dare believe it. It was too much. John felt his knees unhinge, and suddenly he was falling into darkness as the naked boy rose from the floor and came to peek at him through the stall door. The last thing he saw before he blacked out were those 2 green eyes as they bored into him. He came awake with those eyes staring at him. Someone had put him in a bed. The sheets were soft and luxurious, but the blankets were like sandpaper as he lay atop them. The boy perched on his chest was digging into him painfully, and as he woke up, the boy smiled and crawled to snuggle under the blanket. He wrapped his small arms around him and noticed the uncomfortable fabric not at all. John felt the comfortable press of his son's as he lay beside him. How many days had he woken up just like this? Malcolm pressed between him and his wife as they slept together, his warm comfort against John's back as he warmed in between them. John wrapped his own arms around him and breathed in the scent of fabric softener, off-brand shampoo his wife bought for them, and the warm grass that always seemed to hang around his son. John opened his eyes. He expected to wake up in his own bed, the dream evaporating around him, but Malcolm was still there. The door opened then. The man from behind the counter walked in, his hard boots knocking on the wooden floor, and he smiled his too wide smile at John. "You're awake," he stated. John sat up and put a protective arm around his son. The boy was dressed in a pair of overalls, a blue shirt beneath, but John saw that he was still wearing the clothes he had arrived in. The room was Spartan, a bed and an end table being their only real elements, and as the smiling man towered over them, John began to feel self-conscious. He slid out of bed, Malcolm still clinging to him, and faced the man. "How is it that you came to have my son?" The man shrugged. "The farm knows what people want. It knows what people need. One day I was sweeping up, and he was just sitting there. He looked up with those big green eyes and asked where his daddy was, and I just knew that sooner or later you'd come looking for him." John ruffled the boy's hair. "I'm glad I did. It seems like everything lately was trying to bring me here." "Are you hungry?" the smiling man asked suddenly. "Margaret is just about to have lunch ready, and she'd be tickled pink if you'd join us." John looked down at Malcolm's 2 green eyes and smiled. "Sure, why not?" They spent the rest of the day together. After lunch, Thomas took them down to feed day-old bread to the ducks in the little pond. Thomas, the smiling man, had finally introduced himself. As he and his wife, a smiling, plump woman of middle age, had fed them from their table, John couldn't take his eyes off of Malcolm. The boy dug into the meal just as his boy always had, like it might be the last one he ever had. And when Margaret offered him a piece of pie, the boy's eyes lit up with excitement. How many birthdays had John seen that same excitement cross his face as the cake came out? Malcolm caught John staring at him and smiled shyly as Margaret added a big scoop of ice cream to go with it. After the ducks, Malcolm noticed a playground in the town commons. He drugged John to a small clearing with wooden climbing courses and metal antiques that spun and bobbled. As John sat and watched, other kids came over to play with Malcolm in that effortless way that children often do. Watching Malcolm play, running during tag or jumping or loping during their make-believe games, filled John with a curious mixture of hope and dread. He hoped this would never end. He hoped he had crashed his car on the way to the farm and this was heaven, and that he could simply sit here and watch his boy play for the rest of his days. At the same time, he dreaded when this would have to end, and his sadness would creep back as the delusion or dream or whatever it was finally ended. "It's best not to think too hard about that, John." John jumped. Thomas had seated himself next to him, the stretched skin on his mouth still fashioned in that rictus of a smile that up close seemed almost painful. Why did he smile like that if the act hurt him? He tried to find his words, but they all seemed to muddy in his mind in the face of that bitter smile. To think about what? How he can be, or how he came to be here. He is here. He's your son, and it's best not to think about it. John watched him as though he might vanish if he looked away. "We can make a place for you here," Thomas continued. "A place for you and Malcolm. You can be part of this community and know the blessing of the bright, as we all do." John snapped his gaze back to Thomas. "I'm sorry, what are you talking about?" Thomas put his old worn hands on his knees and grinned. "Well, you're here now. We have to find the two of you a place in our community." "Why would I do that?" John asked, genuinely perplexed. "Well, you can't leave. The two of you have to stay." John felt himself growing angry, but tried to keep it in check. This man had given him an irreplaceable gift, and it wouldn't be good manners to shout at him. Are you trying to tell me that we can't leave?" Thomas shrugged. "Of course not. You're free to leave at any time. But Malcolm, he is of the bright. You can't take him away from here. It would be cruel to do so." Malcolm ran up about that time, his face flushed with excitement. "Daddy, some of the kids want to know if we'll attend service with them this evening. Can we go? It sounds like fun." John collected Malcolm into his arms then and stood towering over the smiling Thomas. "No, son. I think it's time we left. Your mother will never believe it when I show you to her." But just the thought of sharing Malcolm made John feel strange. Thomas seemed unperturbed by John. "I wouldn't do that, friend. It never ends well. Just leave us alone. All of you, just leave us alone," John said, backing away. He was running by the time he made it to the parking lot. Malcolm's familiar weight carried effortlessly. John's car was conspicuously absent. He had thought it was some kind of illusion. The tan-colored car would appear when he got a little closer. But now, he saw that even the ruts he had left in the dirt were gone. The car was missing. He was left with few options for escape. He turned towards the road and saw the quaint wooden gate rising in the distance. It could have been 50 feet. It could have been 50 miles. John didn't care. As the sun set at his back, He began to walk towards the gate. "Daddy, don't. I feel sick," Malcolm whined. John ignored him, clinging to him as he jogged for the gate. He could flag down a car once they made it to the road. After all, this was a busy road, and a passing trucker or traveler would take them back to the city. They could be home by bedtime. Malcolm could sleep in his own bed, beneath the watchful eye of his baseball posters and his Star Wars ships that hung from the ceiling by fishing line. "Daddy!" Malcolm's voice sounded hoarse. The dirt puffed under his feet as he jogged. With every step, he expected a torch-bearing mob to rise up to block their path. They wouldn't want him to take this miracle child from them, something that should not exist, and they would fight to stop him from leaving. He would fight them. They would kill him, but he would fight them. He would die, but his last image would be of Malcolm as he, "Stop it! I feel sick, Daddy! I don't want to leave! I want to! I want to!" Malcolm became dead weight in his arms as he jogged. The stile came up before him, and he hefted the child into his arms as he ran. Malcolm was heavy, his skin clammy. Something like sweat or tears dampened John's shirt as he ran. He was suddenly fearful. What if they had poisoned him? What if they had done something to Malcolm so he couldn't leave? He finally looked down at his precious son and screamed into what had once been Malcolm's face. John found he was holding something akin to a lump of clay in his arms, just like a child's approximation of a person. The arms were thick and lumpy, the body little more than a badly formed torso of androgynous humps. The head was malformed, its eyes and mouth little more than scooped out holes with tufts of hair shoved hastily into the muck. When it turned its face to him and spoke, Malcolm rasped out garbled words full of pain and confusion. John felt that he must surely be going mad. He fell to his knees, the gates within arm's reach, and wept into the bulbous chest of Malcolm's newly formed body. This was unbearable. To lose his son again, and in such a way as this, was unthinkable. He couldn't recover from this. If this was really some dream, then this would be the part where he would wake up screaming into his pillow. Things like this didn't happen under the eyes of a loving God. There was only so much pain a man could take before he broke completely. He knelt in the dirt and sobbed into the mushy chest of his twice-lost son, praying for insanity, praying for an end to understanding. It was dark when Thomas found them. John didn't shudder or even acknowledge him when he put a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to him, and in the moonlight, his smile looked ghoulish. "Why?" John croaked, his face awash with the muddy flesh of his still croaking boy. "Why?" Thomas only shook his head, grinning. "I tried to tell you, friend. The gifts of Bright Farm are only for those who accept the bright. The miracles experienced here are not for the outside world. If you want to stay with Malcolm, then you must stay near the bright." John turned back to the odd boy thing. He stared at it for a long time. "If I accept this bright, my son will be returned to me?" "As he was before," Thomas assured. John looked away, and in the moonlight his martyr's mask was ghastly with the mush of his son's chest. "Show me." Thomas took him by the hand. He led John towards the chapel that lay beyond the cowshed. Inside, a sun seemed to shine only for those within. As they approached, John could feel it baking him and felt the warmth fill him. He felt his fear, his anger, his sadness, and all his doubt burned from him. Someone by the wooden door took the boy shape from him, and at that moment he barely noticed. He had discovered something new, something old. As the doors were opened and the baking bright shone over him, he felt his lips pulled into a painful smile. The bright was all he ever needed, the thing he wanted but never knew. He was burned anew by the bright, and it was good. The van pulled up in the dirt parking lot of the little community. The ramp came down, and the sandy-haired woman rolled her wheelchair onto the metal slab. As it descended, She began looking at the gawking faces that had gathered to see her descent. She had used a wheelchair since the accident, but she refused to let it stop her. Even if she had to crawl, she wouldn't have allowed it to stop her from finding John. For 6 months, she'd recovered in the hospital alone. For 6 months, he had ignored her phone calls. When the bank had called to let her know that her mortgage hadn't been paid in 6 months, she was worried. When the police called her to tell her her husband's car had been found abandoned on the stretch of road leading up to this place, she was terrified. When her friend Lisa had seen him at the farmer's market, selling quilts and homegrown vegetables, she was furious. He had abandoned their old life to find himself in the country, it seemed, leaving her in the ICU to fight for her life and worry about him as he slid into silence. She meant to find him and make him answer for his absence. The wheels of the chair didn't much care for the dirt path that led up to the 2-story houses that seemed to be the living quarters of this little community. The man on the phone had told her that John lived in the house closest to the playground, and as she rolled towards that playground, she felt her arms grow stiff and non-compliant. She sat in the dirt road and gawked at the perfect, sandy-haired boy that was now standing atop the play structure and laughing with the other overall-clad children. Malcolm. It was Malcolm. He looked at her then, and she saw recognition dawn on his face. He jumped from the structure, landing in that way that seems the providence of only children and drunks, and ran to her with guileless joy. He buried his face against her chest, rubbing his soft hair against her, and fixed her with those deep green eyes that had enchanted her since birth. It was him, in the flesh, and as he hugged her, she could no more summon the strength to hug him back than she could have summoned the strength to strangle him to death. "Mommy! Mommy! I missed you!" She saw a man rise from the bench, and through his tangled beard she could see it was John. He was smiling, his face a rictus of pleasured pain. His mouth smiled, but as she saw his eyes, she felt a stab of pain rip through her heart. His eyes were pinched, screaming, and as he approached, he seemed to be begging her to run. He bent to hug her, melding against his son easily as the two embraced her like some lost relation who had come back again. How is this possible, John?" He smiled at her with that painful grin. "Come to the barn, Claire. All things can..." I grew up around the Tennessee area in the mid-90s. To call my area rural would have been a bit of an understatement. Dad was probably the only fella in a 20-mile radius that didn't own a farm, and that's because he was the town vet. He ran the local animal hospital, being the only certified animal doctor in the county. That meant he was away at all hours of the day and night. My mom died when I was very young, and Dad seemed to have taken it pretty hard. I can't remember seeing a picture of her until I was nearly grown, and Dad always said it was too hard to talk about her when I tried to ask him. I remember spending a lot of time with my grandma growing up, which is how I found the TV show in the first place. Grandma lived by herself on the property we lived on. I think technically the land was hers, but she let Dad have some of it to put a house on when he and Mom got married. If Dad had to leave suddenly or just go to work like regular, I would stay with Grandma, and she didn't seem to mind the company. There was always something to do at her house, and we would often spend the mornings picking berries or weeding the garden or tending the chickens that she kept for eggs and meat, and sometimes we would just walk around, and Grandma would show me certain plants and berries that were okay to eat or good for helping with ailments. After lunch, however, was when Grandma liked to watch her soaps, and that was a time when Grandma was not to be interrupted. I tried to watch them with her a few times, but they were pretty dull for a kid my age. I caught some of my grandma's side-eyed glances as I fidgeted and wiggled on the couch beside her, and while I was trying to be quiet, I could tell she was a little bit annoyed. It was hard for me to get into what they were talking about, and sometimes I just laid down and took a nap while she watched. One day, I came in to see that there was a little white TV sitting in the den, and asked her what it was for.
That is so you have something to watch while I'm watching my soaps. It was your dad's when he was young, and it's only got about 10 channels on it, and you'll have to use the rabbit ears if you want to get all 10, but it'll give you something to do instead of being bored. On that, she had been right. The TV was a little black and white set that if I adjusted the metal rabbit ears on top, I could get all kinds of things. Most of it was boring too, news or farm reports or other soap operas, but if I adjusted the rods, I could get PBS on there too. I've spent many lunchtimes watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or Sesame Street, and the little TV was a nice treat after a morning of helping Grandma with her chores. Sometimes I'd watch it in the afternoons too if Grandma was doing something that was too hard for me or was on the phone with a friend of hers. One afternoon, about a month before school started, I was trying to get the rabbit ears to play Channel 9, which showed cartoons in the afternoon. Grandma was on the phone with one of her friends, gossiping likely, and I'd been told to go play while she talked in the other room. I could have used the TV in the living room, but I'd really come to like the little black and white set in the den. It was fun to turn the wires and get the signal just right. I'd gotten pretty good at it. I was trying to get it right on that day, hoping I hadn't missed too much of Thundercats, when something came through that I'd never seen before. It was a show with puppets, and it was definitely different from what I usually found on Channel 8. The puppets were singing a song about the sun and how its brightness was so good, and I decided to watch for a few minutes before trying to find my usual cartoons. I'd grown up in the South and knew a religious puppet show when I saw one. I'd grown up in the era of Gospel Bill Show and Colby's Clubhouse. Public access usually could be counted on to have a few others that were less fancy, and this one appeared to be in that vein. All the puppets looked like someone had bought them second-hand and dressed them in homemade clothes. They were interspersed with real kids and adults, and the host seemed to be a man in overalls with a wide-brimmed hat and a piece of straw in the corner of his mouth. He looked like he was running a country store, and as he wiped the counter, puppets and people came in looking for things. As the song about the sun ended, the camera opened back on the man wiping the counter, humming the same tune the kids had been singing. He looked up, surprised, and seemingly greeted me as if I'd walked in. "Well, hello! Welcome to Bright Farm. I'm Thomas. Welcome to my store. You look like you might be looking for something specific. I knew a man who was looking for something particular once. He found it in the Wonder Barn, where many miracles happen. His name was Joe, and here's his story of finding the light." I watched as a sad puppet cried over a gravestone. His son had died, and the puppet man fell into despair as he grieved for his lost boy. Over time, he found the farm and found that his son had been there. In the end, the puppet had embraced the floating ball of light that seemed to hover over the farm, and his frown had become a smile. The longer I watched, the less this seemed like your typical kid's puppet show. Usually the subject of Jesus or God would come up at least once, and the ball of bright light seemed to be what they were all talking about. As the story ended, Joe's wife came to visit them as her sad frown was also replaced by a smile. That's when all the puppets began to sing about embracing the light and surrendering to the bright. They all threw their hands up as they sang, the bright light showering them in constant aura, and in that light, their smiles looked weird. The thread they had used was red, and it made their faces look pained, like they might be bleeding. Their eyes still appeared sad, and the duality gave them a manic look that I couldn't shake. It wasn't until later that I wondered how I'd seen the thread at all. The TV set was black and white. The thread, the sun, everything should have been monotone. As the story ended, Thomas came back and said how wonderful it was to embrace the bright. You could embrace the bright too, you know. It's easy. You just have to accept the bright into your home, your community, your world, and it will come to you. Let the bright shine through you so that it might discover your friends and neighbors. Let the bright bring joyful warmth to your community and discover what it's like to live in its warmth. The way he stared at me through the TV set was starting to make me feel uncomfortable, and when I reached out to turn the knob, I could swear his eyes followed my hand. The knob clicked over to 8, and I found the end credits for the Thundercats. I wasn't sure how I had come to somehow be between Channel 7 and Channel 8, but it appeared that I had. I wasn't sure how I felt about the show, a show I just called The Bright Show in my mind, but it wasn't the last time I saw it. I found it again about a week before school started, but it was only a quick burst of static as the puppets reappeared and sang about worshiping the bright. They were raising their felt hands to the sky as a painted background of a placid field set behind them. Their eyes looked crazy, and their smiles seemed to stretch across their faces like jokers from Batman. Words repeated again and again, the tempo increasing. The whole thing just seemed surreal after a while. I finally turned the channel after some undeterminable amount of time, and the ensuing static made me feel less crazy. After that, I didn't see it again for a while. I'd started kindergarten in the fall, and my days were a little more organized after that. Grandma had kept me on a routine, but it was always one that matched what she was doing. Suddenly there was schoolwork and recess and new friends and a big playground, and I came home every day with a backpack of artwork and a body that was ready to drop. I napped some afternoons, but if I wasn't napping, I was probably watching TV in Grandma's living room. She hadn't usually used the TV in the afternoon, not until Wheel of Fortune came on, and I was free to watch whatever I wanted. My arms were too tired to fiddle with the rabbit ears, so I lay on the couch and watched my cartoons in color for a change. Then one afternoon, I came home to find Grandma watching something on the news. An oil tanker had gotten into an accident near our town and set some of the woods on fire. Grandma wanted to make sure that none of her friends or family were in danger, and she told me to go watch TV on the little set instead. She was on the phone with one of her gossip friends as she said it, and the two were chatting animatedly as I slunk off to the den. I was trying to find cartoons again, adjusting the wires so I could get the right channels, but when the singing began to crackle over the speakers, I knew I'd found that strange puppet show again. This time, as the static cleared and the picture came into focus, I saw the little card for Bright Farms appear from between some clouds before becoming the inside of the shop again. This time, however, there was a woman in a long dress wiping the counter instead of Thomas. She looked up as the camera panned in, and her face seemed to possess recognition, as if she knew the person approaching. "It's you! Good to see you again. I'm Miss Mary, and this is the general store. Thomas is out handling some things, so I'm in charge for a little bit. Sometimes we aren't sure we can handle things on our own, but with the Bright, all things are possible. Let's take a look at Micah, who isn't sure that she can handle her workload, until discovering her true calling with the Bright." The story was about a woman with a struggling business, but I was finding it hard to concentrate on the story. The woman presenting the tale was familiar somehow, though I didn't think I'd ever seen her. Her hair was pulled back into a bun of dark chestnut locks, and her smile reminded me of the puppets I sometimes saw after their smiles had been attached. The skin around the corners of her mouth was red and angry looking, but her smile was huge and inviting. The puppets and the stories suddenly meant very little, and I found myself waiting for the time I could see Miss Mary and hear her talk to me. I started tuning in more often after that, and I found Miss Mary behind the counter of the general store more often than not. Whatever business Thomas was on seemed to keep him away from the shop more and more. Miss Mary introduced stories about people who discovered their lives had little meaning, their problems had little meaning, and their pursuit had little meaning when they brought it before the Bright. People who lost children, treasures, opportunities, and everything in between found them inside the depths of the Wonder Barn. Miss Mary talked about giving yourself over to the Bright and and letting it change you for the better. And I was entranced by the lovely voice of the new host. It was all so wonderful, until one day it all changed. One day, Miss Mary told a story that was very personal to her journey to the bright, a story that someone heard who shouldn't have. After that, the little TV was a daily part of my life. I'd get home from school and rush to Grandma's so I could find the show on the channels between 7 and 8. It didn't always work, and sometimes I had to content myself with other shows, but I started to notice that it didn't really have a set time that it came on. Most times I found it on between 2:30 and 3, but I've also watched it at 4, 7, 8, 9, and even once at 11 o'clock at night. The time didn't seem to be as important as the act of looking for the show, though I never understood that as a kid. No matter when I found it, Miss Mary was there to greet me and tell me how much she'd missed me. Wherever Thomas was, he had apparently decided to stay, because the smiling woman seemed to have taken over the show. There was always a story, plenty of songs, sometimes letters that they read on the show. Children would send letters to Miss Mary and talk about how neat the show was and how they wanted to learn more about the bright. Miss Mary would always tell them to look for the bright inside themselves, invited into their homes and communities. And then there would be a song or a dance about following the bright or believing in the bright. The more I watched, the more I kind of wanted to know more about the bright. I knew it was blasphemous, but sometimes I would even pray for the bright to come into my home so that I would maybe get to meet Miss Mary. It all came to a head one day when I came home, took my snack from Grandma, and went into the den to watch TV. I didn't even have to adjust it anymore. I never changed the channel. I never moved the aerials, and as the set came on, I heard the slightly distorted theme song play as the show began. The title card appeared between two clouds, and then the scene transitioned to the country store. Miss Mary was looking up, watching as the camera zoomed in, and her eyes seemed to be locked onto mine. This had seemed creepy when Thomas had done it, but when Miss Mary did it, it filled me with joy and a longing that I'd never known before that day, the day she had first appeared. "It's you again! I'm so glad you came to visit." Then she surprised me by saying my name. I was speechless. Shows often talk to the audience, even sometimes pretending that they could see you, but Miss Mary had said my actual name. I gaped at her as she continued to smile back at me, and when she laughed, I felt a little better. "Don't look so surprised. I know your name. I've always known it. You're very special to me, and the bright. So special that I've broken the rules to try to reach you. The bright doesn't usually let us do this, but I think you might be ready to come visit, just like I came to visit the bright." I leaned in close, my nose almost touching the TV screen, and when she leaned in too, I almost thought she might reach out of the set and scoop me up. Let me tell you all about it in today's story of a woman who found her way into the light. The scene changed, and suddenly there was a puppet that looked a lot like Miss Mary. She was standing in front of a drawing of a house, and I thought that even though it was crudely done, the house looked familiar. The Miss Mary puppet looked sad as she walked around in front of the house, and as another puppet walked on screen, he looked sad too. The puppet was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a beard. The puppet wore round glasses and had a mole on his left cheek. The puppet looked familiar, but I hadn't yet placed him yet. Mary felt unfulfilled. She had a husband and a home and a baby on the way, but Mary felt as if her life had no meaning. The husband puppet put an arm around Mary, hugging her before waving as he left her in front of the house. Her husband was often gone for work, and Mary was left alone with her thoughts. She didn't feel very important, like a housekeeper more than anything, and as she cleaned and cooked, the Bright saw her despair and wanted to help. The Mary puppet looked behind her, and suddenly there was a bright light in the sky. It transitioned to a TV in her home and showed her sitting on the couch and watching a program. The Bright sent Mary a show and told her all about how she could be happy. It told her people were waiting for her, people who would give her purpose, and all she had to do was come to them. The Bright on the little TV that Mary watched was much smaller, but it blinked like a Christmas light as she watched it. She turned the TV off suddenly, though, stroking her belly as she thought about things. She was clearly very confused about what to do, and the longer I watched, the more I started to wonder if this episode was really for me. Mary didn't think she could leave before her baby was born, and she felt sad that she would leave her husband in the state that he was in. He was so sad, and he didn't even know it, just like Mary had been. She tried to tell him about the program. Sure enough, the husband puppet came back, and Mary tried to tell him. The husband puppet listened, but eventually he shook his head and crossed his arms. He turned away from her, walking out of shot as he left. But he wouldn't listen. He was stubborn and felt that what she was saying was wrong. He clung to the God of his father, of his community, and he told her not to be so easily swayed. Mary thought that maybe she had been wrong and stopped letting the Bright into her home and into her heart. The scene changed, and suddenly the Mary puppet had a baby in her arms. She gave birth to her baby, and for a while, everything was okay. Her husband was around more often, and she didn't feel so alone. She didn't need the TV show or the Bright, and thought that she could make it just fine on her own. Mary didn't know, however, how wrong she was. The husband puppet came into view and hugged Mary while the narrator was telling the story. The two looked happy, and they both looked at the baby lovingly. Mary rocked the baby and gave it a little bottle, but eventually the husband puppet left again with a wave of his hand. But eventually her husband had to return to work, and Mary was left all alone again. The Mary puppet sat on the couch, looking sad as she cared for the baby. She felt alone and overwhelmed by the new baby, and as the sadness began to creep in again, she rediscovered her old show. She watched it all the time, at least when her husband wasn't around. She started praying to the Bright and asking it to come into her home, her neighborhood, her heart. She became a convert, but was unsure of how to continue. How do you worship with no church? How do you bask in the glow with no Bright? Mary didn't know, but the Bright did. Mary needed to go to the farm, where all things were possible. She needed to visit the Wonder Barn, see the Bright Chapel, and bask in the Bright for herself. Mary got up to go, but her husband came back, and now he seemed mean. He pushed Mary down, taking the baby with him and locking her behind a door. The puppet sat down, her head against her knees, and appeared to cry. But Mary's husband didn't believe, and when she told him that she was going to the Bright farm to be with her own kind, he took the baby from her and locked her in a bedroom. He thought that if she were separated from the show, she would come back to her senses. He didn't realize that the Bright was inside her, and that it would show her the way. All at once, the Bright was inside the room. A window appeared, and the puppet jumped from it and left the room, the Bright close behind her. She walked and walked, but eventually she came to the farm, and lots of other smiling people came to greet her. They hugged her and celebrated her arrival, and all of them worshiped the Bright together. Mary escaped, and after a long journey, she found her way to the Bright farm. She met with Brother Thomas and the others who lived there, and they all worshiped and had fellowship with the Bright together. Mary was sad to leave her baby, but she knew that if she served the Bright, then one day her child would be returned to her. The puppet segment ended and Miss Mary was back. She was staring much too intently at the screen, her smile looking raw as it spread from ear to ear. I wondered if she ever stopped smiling, but I had my answer when I looked into her eyes. Her eyes didn't look sad like the puppets had. Her eyes looked crazy, and as I watched, I saw they weren't as focused on me as they had been. They were focused over my shoulder, and I would soon learn why. "Hello, husband. Are you ready to embrace the bright? Are you ready to return my child to me? It isn't too late. You can still join me on the farm. You can still bask in the bright." I heard a noise, a soft negation from paralyzed lips, and turned to see my dad standing in the entrance to the den. He had the big leather bag in his hand that he used when he went to see his four-legged patients, and it made a heavy thump as it hit the floor. He stared at the woman for a long moment, and when he moved, it was like watching someone blink forward. He flipped the little table that the TV was on, and when it hit the ground, something inside it broke. The screen went dark, and the outer housing crackled. The image of the smiling woman was frozen there for several seconds before the static took it away. Grandma came in and asked what was wrong, and Dad started yelling at her. He said a lot of things I didn't understand. He asked her how she could let me watch the same filth that had taken away my mother. How could she be so careless as to let it pollute me as well? He yelled a lot, and most of it was scary, but not as scary as when he started crying. He fell to his knees in front of her, and suddenly he was loosing these hopeless, bellowing cries of pain. He wrapped his arm around her knees, crying like a giant child who's lost something dear to him, and Grandma just sank to her knees too as she patted his back and made soothing noises. I came to hug him too, wanting my dad to stop crying, and when he pulled me into his arms, I felt his tears on my shirt as he hugged me back. I wouldn't think about that show again for many years, and by then, Dad was beyond tears. He died when I was a senior in high school. I found him in his bed one morning, splayed out and staring at the ceiling. He was clutching his chest, his face a mask of fear, and I called the paramedics right away. There was nothing they could do. He'd been dead for hours, and I buried him long before I was ready to lose him. After the funeral, Grandma asked me to come over so she could tell me some things that Dad hadn't wanted me to know. She sat on the front porch so we could smoke, something I'd never seen her do before, but something she needed to do to get through this. "Your mother isn't dead. She fell in with a weird cult before you were born, and despite your dad's best efforts, he couldn't stop her from going to him. What he could do, though, was take you away from her and lock her in a bedroom in the hopes that she'd get over it. He hoped she would. He really loved your mom. But when he found out that she had gone out the window to be with him, it broke his heart. He told you that she died so you wouldn't go looking for her. He was afraid that you might get mixed up with that cult too, and then he'd have lost both of you." "Why tell me then?" I asked, the wind making the wind chimes jangle as we sat on the porch and felt the February cold sink into us. "'Cause you have a right to know. Your father's death was a surprise to everyone, including him, and I don't want to die without telling you. The truth may not set you free, but it's your truth to have, and keeping it from you won't make it any easier. Here," she said, taking something out of her shirt pocket and handing it to me. "It's the only picture of your mother I could find. It's a little old, 19 years old, I suppose, but it's the only one I have. She's pregnant with you in it. You can see the little—" "What? What's wrong, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Grandma was right. I had seen a ghost. The woman staring back at me in the picture was someone I hadn't seen in many years. The woman staring back at me was standing with a man who, despite his young age, had salt and pepper hair, a short beard, and a mole on his left cheek. The glasses he wore were the same kind he was buried in, and he looked happier than I'd ever seen him. They were standing in front of a much newer house, but it was a house I'd seen in the background of that long-ago story. It was Miss Mary in the picture, standing with my dad in front of their house. I started out like most people my age would, with a trip to Google. I didn't expect to find a box set for Bright Church or anything, but I'd hoped that maybe a couple episodes existed on YouTube or something. I knew from experience that certain fandoms always seem to spring up from next to nothing, and I was hoping that the Bright Farm show might be one of those too. I also knew that shows from the 80s and 90s always had spotty records, so whatever I was likely to find would be something recorded off a VHS or maybe camera footage. An hour later, however, I was coming up with nothing. YouTube had nothing for me. A Google search brought me a dairy farm in the Midwest, but it didn't look anything like the show. I found no clips, no sound bites, nothing to show that it had ever existed. So I went to the last place I could think to try. I went to Reddit. I posted in their Lost Media, Find a Show, and Foggy Memories subs, along with others, and sat back to wait for a reply. Hey, I remember seeing a show when I was young called Bright Farms. It was maybe religious, I think, but not the usual Baptist or Presbyterian access show. It had puppets and weird lessons that ultimately tried to lead people to the bright or something like that. I lived in Tennessee, and it came on either Channel 7 or Channel 8 on the old TV my grandma let me use. I sat for a while, doing other things as I waited for the replies, but it took a while for anyone to take notice. I was working from home at this time, the pandemic having recently sent most of us to work from home, and after a while, I'd almost forgotten about it. I was eating a little lunch about 5 hours later when I remembered the post and went to see if anyone had responded. There were several replies, but only a few that were helpful. Seemed I wasn't the only one who had seen the show. Bendross. Wasn't the host in a country store or something? He was an old McDonald kind of guy with suspenders and a big beard, right? I think his name was Tom or Tim. Me. Yeah, it was Thomas, but the one I remember was Miss Mary. Pigella Snork responded, It didn't come on channel 7 or 8. It came on the channel between 7 and 8. Like, you had to toggle the switch just right, and that was the only way you could find it. Normal Redditor 3357 put in, Man, I haven't thought of that show in years. As I type this up, I'm humming that song they sang all the time, the one about worshiping the bright. Such a banger. Wish I could find it, but it doesn't seem to be anywhere. Bendross to Pigglesnork. Yeah, you're right. I remember my brother and I holding the knob sometimes on the old Philco we had, so, it didn't snap over to 8. I can't remember it real well. I assumed we made it up, but I'll ask my brother about it when he comes home for lunch. I scrolled past a couple of useless responses until I found another one that I liked. Someone named Creaky Crafty Crabbling had responded, Miss Mary was the host when I used to watch it. She always kind of scared me. She was so weird, like she was looking for someone. I don't know how, but she always seemed disappointed to see me. After a while, she seemed to get mad, like she wanted someone else to watch and didn't like seeing me. Me to Creaky Crafty Crabbling. She always seemed happy to see me, but I agree that it was a little weird. It almost seemed like it wasn't recorded at all. It almost felt live. When did you watch the show? Creaky Crafty Crabbling responded, In 91, after school. Me. That's when I used to watch it, up until my dad made me stop. Bendross came back, responding to something I'd said. Me too. My brother and I watched it after school in 91 and 92. I think we might have watched it a few times after that, but we stopped watching it for some reason. I can't remember why. Maybe we just outgrew it. Piggle Snort came back then. I watched it in '92, but I kind of outgrew puppets after that. I think it still comes on, but it's like hard to find TVs with dials anymore, and it doesn't seem to work on new TVs. Me. Does anyone know if there are VHS tapes of it? Is there maybe a particular place where it was recorded? My dad thought it was run by a cult and that my mom might have been part of it. My grandmother showed me a picture after my dad died, and I think the host, Miss Mary, might have been my mother. I kind of regretted posting that when the responses dried up after the constant back and forth for the last 30 minutes. Had I crossed a line? Had my little bombshell been too much? I got back to work, checking back often, and when a message finally popped up, I realized my error. Piggle Snork, to me. Are you playing with us? Because if you're trying to pull some ARG make-believe creepypasta bullcrap, then we're not buying it. Clearly you've seen the show, and that's the only reason I'm responding at all, but if this is a game to you, then don't bother responding. If you're being legitimate, then maybe post the picture you're talking about, so we can judge for ourselves. Luckily for me, Grandma had let me keep the picture, and I was able to snap a pic and send it to the 4 users that had been talking to me. The response came back pretty quickly, and it seemed that Piggle Snork believed me. Okay, I believe you. It's a little weird to think about any of this being real, but I guess stranger things have happened. I don't have a clue where Bright Farm is, but I can maybe do a little digging and see what I can find. Crafty Creaky Crabbling came back about that time. I don't know where it is either, but I do know where you might get tapes if you're interested. Me. Yes, please, if you know anything, anywhere I might could get tapes, just let me know. Bendross came back then. Creaky, I know you're not suggesting that she goes to Video Time Capsule. Creaky Crafty Crabbling to Bendross. I was, actually. You know it's the best chance of her finding anything. Piggle Snork. OMG, that place is sketchy AF. If you go, please take someone with you. The guy there is really creepy. Bendross came back then. I don't recommend going at all. That place is very sketchy, and some of the things he offers are a little too good to be true. Bendross and Piggle Snork tried to talk me out of it, but eventually I just messaged Creaky to get the address. He sent me an address in South Carolina, and a warning. His prices are high, and he only takes cash. Make sure you bring enough to pay for what you're looking for. I sat there, looking at the address, wondering if this was the lead I'd been waiting for. I didn't know anyone who'd be willing to come with me, but the GPS says the store is an 8-hour drive from my house. It's the best lead I've had so far, and I feel like it's my best chance to find what I'm looking for. I went and talked to my grandma after that, and she looked worried. She's been supportive of me searching for my mom, but I can tell that the idea of me getting close to the Bright Church scares her. She remembers what it was like when Mom left, and she doesn't want to lose me too. I'll help you any way I can, kiddo, but I really hope you aren't getting in over your head. I had the picture out again, staring at the smiling woman in the old photo and wondering if she would still be anything like this. She looked so different in this picture than Miss Mary did. That wasn't entirely true. Most of the changes were something I could attribute to the cult. But would she still want to see me? Would she want anything to do with me, besides just trying to get me to join her cult? In my mind, I thought maybe I could save her, bring her back to reality, and we could be a family again. I'd lost Dad, but if Mom was still out there, I wanted to know that she was okay. I need to know, Grandma. I need to know if she's still alive. I've no desire to join the Bright Church, but I do want to see her. Grandma nodded. I thought you might say that. She went to her room and brought back an envelope. Under her arm, she also had the old TV I had watched as a kid, though she seemed less sure that that would help me. She sat both on the table, but it was the envelope that she slid towards me first. Your dad left you some money when he died. He left you more than that, but if you're gonna go chasing ghosts or cults, this might help. The house is yours too, and his truck. Pretty much left everything to you," she said with a little chuckle. I opened the envelope and found more than I had expected. Dad had been a man of means, but I hadn't expected anything like this. This would definitely get me where I needed to go, and the truck would get me there quicker than my dodgy old Corolla would. I thanked Grandma for giving it to me, but she just waved her hand dismissively. "It belongs to you. I was just holding it for a rainy day. Please do me a favor, though, if you're serious about this." I told her I would, and she reached over to take my hands as she leaned in to look me in the eye. "Come back safe. I've already had to bury your father. I'm too old to bury my only grandchild, too. Come back safe to me. Bring your mother if you can. If you can't, then I'll gladly take you safe and sound, and count myself very lucky." I'm about to hit the road now. An overnight bag in the back seat and the old TV on the front seat beside me. I'm not sure why I brought it, but it seemed right that I should. Dad's truck still smells like him, and it makes me nostalgic as I sit here, writing this and breathing in the aromas of old tobacco, lye soap, ancient fast food, and spearmint. It makes me a little sad when I realize that these smells will be gone someday, and I'll be left with just a memory of my stoic old dad. I'll let you know when I get to this place, and I'll keep you posted on my progress. Wish me luck. Dave knew something was off from the moment the knife sliced into the turkey, but he put it out of his mind as he served the meat to his guests. It was nerves, he told himself. This was their first year hosting the family Thanksgiving, his family and his in-laws both being in attendance, and as Dave tasted the expertly cooked bird, he set his fears to rest. It was delicious, one of the best turkeys he'd ever eaten, and he pushed the mashed potatoes onto the golden flesh as he shoveled it into his mouth. The table had been lengthened for their guests, and the whole clan sat around as they talked, laughed, and ate. Dave looked around at the gathering and was glad they had agreed to host this year. Normally, Thanksgiving was a hectic time for his family. They would start their day at 7:30, getting the girls ready so they could leave by 9 and arrive at his parents' house by 10. They would visit for a little while, having an early lunch at 11, leaving by 1 to arrive at her parents' house by 2. After some socializing, they would eat turkey dinner at 4, and she and her mother, sometimes with her younger sister in tow, would go out to hit the Black Friday deals while Dave and his brother-in-law Terry watched the kiddos. By the time they got back, Dave was exhausted and still stuffed from dinner, and God help him if his office didn't give him the next day off, because he'd be good for little after all that. But that was before they'd bought the house. The house was so big and beautiful that it had just made sense to host both families and be done with it. Dave's mother was already planning to join the Black Friday festivities with Sylvia and her family, and Dave was looking forward to putting on his pajamas and relaxing after the meal was finally put away. The kids could play in the backyard or rest in the living room, the adults could get comfortable or head out to shop, and Dave could rest a little instead of going non-stop all day. Yup, Dave thought as he poured more gravy on his turkey, this year was gonna be different. It wasn't until he started putting away the leftovers that he remembered that funny feeling he'd got when he sliced the bird earlier. The green bean casserole, mashed potatoes, rolls, corn, and even the pumpkin pie that remained had been easily stored in Tupperware containers, so they could either go to various houses with his family members, or be returned to the fridge to make sandwiches and plates for the next few days. Dave was in his comfy pants, the sweats he liked to wear while he watched football or did house chores, and as his belly pushed at the waistband, he was once again happy that he didn't have to ride out the rest of the evening on his in-law's couch while his belly pushed at his jeans like a bloated whale. The electric knife buzzed as he cut the turkey, putting the pieces into an extra-large Tupperware. There was more than he'd expected, especially considering how much his guests had put away. Terry was currently snoring on the couch, his overshirt unbuttoned to reveal the rise and fall of his swollen stomach. Terry had eaten 4 helpings of the turkey all by himself, and between the lot of them, they should have eaten several turkeys. When the Tupperware was full, the lid barely closing on the almost 3-gallon container, Dave furrowed his brow at the still mostly whole turkey that sat on the counter. Halfway through filling another container, he heard Sylvia come back from her shopping adventure. "Well," she said, shopping bags fluttering as she came into the kitchen, "I had to knock some old lady over, and I'm pretty sure my face is hanging somewhere in a Walmart backroom of people to throw out, but I think I got everything on our kids' Christmas list." Her joking smile turned into something more akin to, "Really?" as she saw Dave putting away the turkey. "Had a little nap before you started on those leftovers, huh?" she asked playfully. "Nah," Dave said, his attention on the turkey as he carved a long piece and tossed it into the bucket. "I've been carving for hours." Sylvia whistled as she looked at the huge container of turkey already in the fridge. "My goodness, I guess my turkey wasn't up to par." Dave shook his head. "Watch this," his face very close to the area he had just cut off the turkey. As Sylvia turned her attention to the bird, it was hard to miss as the flesh grew back into the spot he had just cut. Sylvia let her mouth slip open, casting a glance at the kitchen door as her sister tried to coax Terry off the couch so they could return home. "What the hell was that?" "I was hoping you could tell me. Where did you get this turkey?" "From Kroger. Same place I always get it." Dave went to the garbage, digging out the plastic covering and reading the label. It looked normal, a thin, flesh-colored bag with some plastic netting inside to hold the bird, but the label looked different than he was used to. A large Technicolor sun was rising up behind a barn, and the words Bright Farms were visible before it. Bright Farms wasn't a brand that Dave was familiar with, but as he watched Sylvia cut slice after slice off the turkey, he had to say it was a brand that was growing on him. Sylvia laughed at the large Tupperware as it bulged with bird meat. "Weird, but in a good way. What do we do with all this meat?" Dave shrugged. "I'm sure this is just some kind of fluke. We'll enjoy it while it lasts." "Do we put it in the fridge, you think? Would that ruin it?" she asked, indicating the turkey. Dave just shrugged again, and the two made room for the almost full turkey as they closed everything up and went to bed. Dave figured that putting in the cold would end whatever good fortune they had had, but he hardly wanted to wake up to a rotten turkey. Besides, it couldn't last forever. "Ugh, turkey again?" Ella asked, moving the turkey around her plate as she glowered at the golden meat. "I like it," said Claire, their youngest, as she spooned mashed potatoes onto her plate. "It's yummy." "There are starving kids right here in town, Els," Dave said good-naturedly. "Might as well eat." "Wait," Ella said suddenly. "This isn't the turkey from Thanksgiving, is it?" Dave looked at Sylvia, the two sharing a look that their oldest daughter definitely noticed. "That's disgusting! Thanksgiving was 2 weeks ago. There's no way it's still good." It was actually closer to 3, Dave realized, but time had done nothing to stop the turkey from coming back. Ella had raised an eye when she saw the thing sitting in the fridge still. "It's fine, dear. Your father and I have eaten it, and it tastes just fine. Eat up before it gets cold." They had put it in the air fryer to heat it up, but it always came out just as crispy and golden as it had the first time. The meat never spoiled, even when Sylvia had accidentally left the Tupperware out overnight, and the family had carried on eating it. Dave found it delicious, and Sylvia had joked that she had outdone herself this year. They had been eating turkey regularly ever since Thanksgiving, and no one but Ella seemed to show any signs of stopping. "I'll pass," Ella said, pushing the plate away. "I've been having weird dreams lately. I think it might be the turkey." Dave started to chide her for wasting food, but he too had been having some pretty weird dreams. He couldn't say it was due to the turkey, but it certainly had played a part. Dave had woken up a few times in the kitchen, the fridge door open and pieces of turkey still in his hand. The dreams themselves were usually flashbacks to the Thanksgiving, watching the guests eat and eat as the turkey centerpiece grew to fill the table. The guests grew too, Dave included, though that part seemed grounded in reality. He'd put on 10 pounds in the last few weeks. But he had shrugged it off as holiday weight. With Thanksgiving over and Christmas quickly approaching, there were no end of holiday parties or potlucks at work. Dave watched as Clara took her sister's turkey, as Ella left to go to her room. "Don't worry, Dad," Clara assured him. "I won't let it go to waste." Dave smiled, ruffling his daughter's hair, but noticed a certain roundness to her face. Ella looked about the same as ever, but as Sylvia wolfed down her own turkey, Dave couldn't help but notice that his weight gain wasn't the only new addition to the family. He put it out of his mind as he returned to his dinner. It was just a little holiday weight, nothing more. Dave pursed his lips when he opened the door to find his sister-in-law on the porch. It was the middle of the day. Shouldn't she be at work? "Hey, Stacy, what's up?" She smiled, but it looked a little strained. "Hey, Dave, I was just wondering if you had any more of that turkey." She was trying to put it off as curiosity, but her demeanor made Dave think she was on drugs or something. She was shuffling from foot to foot and scratching her arm, and Dave was a little worried about her. She'd been coming around a lot lately, and he didn't think he'd ever seen her over quite so much. It appeared that Sylvia was giving her turkey. It wasn't like they didn't have plenty of it, but it appeared to be having a negative effect on her. "Sure, I guess. Are you feeling okay? You seem kind of under the weather." "Yeah, I'm okay. I'm just hoping you've got some of that turkey. It's so good. I can't get enough of it. Terry, too. He's been taking it for lunch every day." As she followed him inside, rambling all the way, Dave noticed that he wasn't the only one that had put on a little holiday weight. Stacy had never been very large. At 4'11", she might have weighed 100 pounds the whole time Dave had known her, but now it was clear that she'd been eating more than usual. Her stick-thin frame was getting a little pudgy, and Dave wondered again if it had something to do with all the turkey they were eating. She followed him to the fridge, and sure enough, the turkey was still there in all its glory. The whole bird sat within as 2 tubs of meat sat on either side like silent sentries. He reached for the smaller tub, but changed his mind as he reached for the 2-gallon instead. He could always carve some more. If she had enough, maybe she wouldn't need to come back for a while. The thought was strange to Dave, but he suddenly found himself feeling very protective of the turkey. Stacy looked at the Tupperware of meat as if Dave had just handed her a stack of crisp $100 bills. Thank you so much," she breathed out, sounding relieved as she hugged the container to her chest. She left in a hurry after that, saying they would see them at Christmas for sure, and Dave was left wondering what the hell had just happened. As he watched her go, Dave suddenly wanted to call her back. He wanted to stop her, to tackle her, to take the turkey back, and as he closed the door, he ran heavily back to the fridge, his mind crying out for the delicious meat. He sank his hands into the turkey, pulling out chunks as he pushed it into his mouth. The turkey continued to refresh itself between each bite, the gouges growing before Dave's eyes, and when he sank to the floor at long last, he felt a sense of fulfillment that he'd never felt before. He was showering that night when he noticed the first of the bumps. He felt them through the washcloth as he soaped up, and his fingers shook a little as he dropped the wash rag. They were under his arms, a large patch that stretched down his side, and when Dave checked them in the bathroom mirror, he was shocked. He had thought maybe they were a rash, but the bumps looked less like pustules and more like lesions. The little bumps seemed to be spreading, and Dave didn't like the scaly patches of skin between them either. "What the hell?" he breathed, shivering as his fingers slid over the spots. It felt kind of nice, tickly even, but Dave made a mental note to call the doctor the next day. He'd been meaning to talk to Dr. Malcolm for a while anyway. The weight gain he was experiencing had gone beyond the normal holiday pudge, and the dreams were becoming worse and worse each night. The guests at the table now seemed to be changing before his eyes, eating the turkey as they grew round and squat, their limbs shrinking as their bodies twisted. Their skin would brown, crisping until it looked burnt, and as they all turned to look at him, Dave would come awake with a start. He was becoming worried that there might be something in the turkey that was affecting them negatively. He had noticed Claire and Sylvia seemed to be getting rounder as the days went by, and there was definitely more waddle to their gait than actual stride. He could see himself getting stouter as well, and with the exception of Ella, he felt like all of them might be experiencing a certain amount of binge eating. He could see his family fattening up, but for what? Dave thought for the first time then about getting rid of the turkey, but he wondered how his family would take such an action. Ella would be elated. She'd been cooking her own food to get away from the constant stream of turkey, but Sylvia and Claire would be outraged. They had turkey for breakfast, lunch, and dinner most days, and Dave realized that he was just as guilty. What had started as a cost-saving measure had become an obsession, and Dave wasn't sure he could bring himself to part with that cursed bird either. As he climbed into bed, something made all the more difficult as he had gotten fatter. He put his hand on something coarse that had made its way under his pillow. As he rolled under the covers, Sylvia already snoring beside him, he pulled it out and was surprised to find a handful of feathers under his pillow. He checked his pillow, thinking maybe there was a hole in it, but he couldn't find a source. He was tired by the time he got done and decided to get some sleep. He'd make an appointment tomorrow. Maybe Dr. Malcolm could shed some light on all this. Dave felt the phone shake in his hand as he made the call. The phone number to Bright Farms had been easy enough to find, but as it rang and rang, Dave became worried that no one would pick up. They had to have answers. They had to be responsible for this turkey, after all. Someone had to have some answers, otherwise Dave thought he might just go crazy. Dr. Malcolm certainly hadn't been able to give him any. Dr. Malcolm had only offered more questions. "I don't know what to tell you," Malcolm had said, running his hand over the bumps as he pressed against them. Dave had shuddered. The bumps had spread to his back, and he felt humiliated by the whole experience. He'd been sitting in his gown, 50 pounds heavier than the last time he'd been here a few months ago, feeling like a freak as the bumps covered his ample flesh. As he got undressed, he noticed he had some of them that had migrated to his chest as well, and Dave hoped that Doc might be able to give him some good news. "They aren't pustules or folliculitis, and there doesn't appear to be any drainage from them that I could see. They don't ooze when squeezed, and the x-rays don't show any growths below the skin. It's not a rash or something dermatological. I can't really tell what's going on, but it almost seems like..." He stopped himself, shaking his head as he flopped onto the spindly stool near the wall. "What?" Dave asked, ready to grasp at any straw he might offer. "It almost looks like under a bird's feathers. After you pluck them, their skin looks a lot like that. But that's stupid," he added, laughing a little as he made a note on Dave's chart. Dave agreed, chuckling a little, though he didn't think it sounded so stupid. He had looked up the number shortly after getting home. Dave didn't know what he expected this Bright Farms to tell him, but he knew he needed answers. In his mind, these guys would know what was going on. Maybe they could help shed some light on the situation. With every ring that passed, Dave was more and more certain that no one would pick up. The number would be old. They'd be closed. No one would know what he was talking about. No one would... Someone picked up on the 6th ring, just as Dave was getting ready to hang up. "Bright Farms General Store, Thomas here. How can I help you?" Dave was stunned for a moment, the man having to say hello a couple of times before finally finding the saliva or the words to speak. "Yeah, we bought one of your turkeys this year for Thanksgiving." "Uh-huh," the man said, David hearing a scritch-scratch of a pen. "If you're trying to make a return, you can take it back to the store. We don't have any special return policy or anything." "No, I was just trying to get some information on your products. My turkey seems to be coming back after I cut it, and I'd like to know if there's any side effects from this kind of thing." "Coming back?" the man said, and then Dave heard him gasp, but not like someone who's surprised. He gasped like someone who's seen a celebrity. "Oh my goodness, it's you! You're one of the chosen ones. I've never got to meet one of you before the change. This is amazing. It's an honor, sir. I hope you know how lucky you are. He only chooses a handful every year, and it happens to less than 1% of all those that buy our birds." "What are you talking about?" Dave asked, not sure what to make of all this. "Oh, I'm sorry. It's been 3 weeks. I assumed you'd have already noticed some changes." "What exactly are these changes?" Dave asked, hearing the front door open as the kids came home from school. Ella went straight to her room as she had every day, but Claire made a beeline for the kitchen. Dave could see her as she waddled in, her own change even more noticeable than his own. As she opened the fridge, he was unsurprised to hear the sound of the seal coming off the turkey container. He saw his daughter, normally very athletic and energetic, laboring to breathe as she put the turkey and gravy on a paper plate. Her ankles had begun to thicken, and Dave almost thought he could see something like scales in the patches of flesh between her socks and jeans. Her teacher had called last week about her poor performance, and about how she'd been eating in class, which was not allowed. She'd been sneaking extra turkey to school to eat between meals, and her teacher was threatening to give her detention if she didn't stop. Well, dry patches of skin, bumps, weight gain, sharpening of the bone structure. Have you noticed any feathers appearing randomly yet? That's a big tell. She came out of the fridge with her cheeks already bulging with turkey, and Dave couldn't help but notice the feathers in her hair. As she walked to her room, the plate piled high, the turkey feathers wafted down from her lustrous brown locks. "Don't worry, pal," Thomas went on, clearly grinning on the other end of the phone. "I know this is a lot to take in. We'll send someone over real soon to help walk you through it. Before you know it, you'll also have a new home in the field." Dave let the phone fall to the floor, his feet taking him towards the bathroom in a wobbly gait. He leaned in close as he looked at himself in the mirror, smoothing out the skin on his face as he looked. His face seemed normal, but Dave couldn't help scrutinizing every feature. The bags under his eyes made sense. His dreams had been plagued by the eating dream for almost a month. His skin appeared plumper, but still normal, though Dave couldn't help but see things that may or may not be there. Was his nose sharper? Were his eyes smaller? He looked under his neck, the double chin now very prominent, and he thought there might be some bumps under there too. Maybe one of those chins looked a little like a waddle? He tried to tell himself that it was all in his head, but the longer he looked, the more certain he was that nothing was as he remembered. "What are you doing?" came a voice from behind him, and Dave realized that Sylvia had come home. He turned to tell her everything was okay, but as the tears started falling, Dave fell heavily to his knees and clutched at her. "I'm scared, Sylvia. I don't know what's going on. I'm changing, and I don't know what..." But she put a finger on his lips, and she stooped down, bringing her face close to his. He could see the bumps rising up her neck as they came close, and the longer he looked at her face, the more her nose began to look like a beak. "You're just hungry, dear. Come on, let's get some dinner in you. You'll feel better after that." Dave tried to shake his head, but as she helped him up to lead him to the table, he became less and less sure. Claire was already waiting for them, her eyes glazed over a little as she stared into space. Sylvia was at the table too, feathers rising from the neck of her sweater. And Terry was there too, his nose having taken on the sharp point of a beak as he turned to look at Dave. When he opened his mouth, nothing but a gobble came out, and Dave felt his fear rising up again as Sylvia sat him down beside the turkey man. He wanted to run, he wanted to deny all this, but when she sat the golden brown idol before them, he felt the drool slide down the corners of his mouth and knew that he couldn't leave. They all fell on the bird, ripping and eating as the meat returned as pristine as always, again and again. Dave's fears were nothing before the bird, and as he ate, the people around him grew and grew. Their bodies changed, their features twisted, and when Dave tried to mention it, nothing came out but a thick guttural warble. Soon he wasn't even grabbing the meat anymore. His hands had shrunk into useless wings, and they were all digging mouthfuls of flesh with their sharp beaks. A scream turned their heads towards the living room, and they could all see Ella as she stood in confusion. She retreated then, her door slamming from farther down the hall, but it hardly seemed to matter. The rafter of turkeys turned back to their dead cousin and continued to eat, growing fatter and fatter as they gorged themselves. Thomas found the door unlocked, and as he and his brothers and sisters came into the house, he smiled at the scene before him. 5 fat turkeys, still picking at the bones of their meal as they warbled and gobbled. 3 hens and 2 toms. Not a bad haul at all. They made quite a mess, but that was okay. There would be nothing here for the police to find when they came to investigate. Certainly nothing to tie them to Bright Farms. "Load them up," Thomas said, his family going to work. "We got a few more stops to make before we head back." They herded the birds out the door, running them towards the truck that they had pulled up to the front door, so they didn't have to chase any of them. There were always questions when people saw them running down the road in their overalls and Amish dresses, which led to other unexplained disappearances. It was always better when they came to see the light on their own, but converts sometimes had to be made rather than found. "Who are you? What's going on?" Thomas looked over and saw a girl coming up the hallway. She looked to be about 12 or 13, and scared out of her mind. It appeared that the siren song of the bird had ensnared her, but Thomas knew there was a greater call than that of the turkey. He bent down, giving her his widest smile, as she looked at him with open fear. "My dear, have you ever heard of the Bright? I find it helps put things in perspective. during trying times like this. Dave had never been so happy in his whole life. Being a turkey was easy. Eat, sleep, make little turkeys, and wander the fields around his new home. There was no job to go to, no mortgage to pay, no parties to attend, no conversations to carry, no expectations to live up to. No, he thought as he dug his beak into the ground for more bugs, he was wrong about expectations. Even as a turkey, there was one expectation. He looked up as a group of birds was led to the waiting trailer, their heads held high as they waddled to their destiny. Dave could see a few of them that seemed to have a slight glow inside them, and he knew how lucky they were. There would be some new faces in a few weeks, and Dave knew that soon it would be his turn as well. Easter, or maybe next Thanksgiving, and then he too would fulfill his own expectation. Maybe his glow would grow before that day, and he would be responsible for ushering in some new faces as well. Someone called the turkeys to lunch, and the rafter came running. Dave looked up at the smiling girl holding the bucket, and thought he recognized her for a moment. She looked familiar, her long dark hair in a braid, and a name tried to work its way to the surface before Dave pushed it down, even as he pushed his face into the trough. That was something he had cared about before he'd been a turkey, and the food in the trough was the only thing he cared about now. Eat, sleep, make little turkeys, and grow fat. That was how a turkey fulfilled his destiny.